In a time of great spiritual darkness, when Israel had turned away from the one true God and embraced false idols, a prophet like no other emerged. His name was Elijah, a man whose life would blaze like fire across the pages of history. Clad in a simple garment, his voice thundered against the corruption of kings and priests, calling the people back to the heart of God. Elijah was not just a prophet. He was a force of nature, a vessel of divine power, and a living testament to the reality that one faithful man, fully devoted to God, could change the course of history. Through daring confrontations, miraculous signs, and moments of deep despair, Elijah's story unfolds as a journey of faith, power, and the unshakable belief that God would never abandon his people. From his bold proclamation of a drought to his fiery showdown on Mount Carmel, and even in his moments of loneliness and fear, Elijah's life was marked by the presence and power of God. His story is one of divine purpose, a call to stand firm in faith no matter the odds, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, God's light shines through. But Elijah's story doesn't end with his dramatic departure. In the whirlwind, amidst chariots of fire, Elijah was taken into heaven, leaving behind a legacy that would burn brighter than ever. His name would echo through the ages, inspiring prophets, kings, and followers of God for generations to come. This is the story of Elijah, his triumphs, his struggles, his legacy, and the unrelenting power of a man who devoted his life to God's calling. In a time when the land of Israel lay shrouded in spiritual darkness, a light would rise, a flame of God's anger, righteousness, and grace. The people had turned away from the one true God, swayed by the seductive whispers of false gods, and bowed in worship before Baal, the god of rain and fertility. The idols of wood and stone had stolen their hearts, and the prophets of the Lord seemed few and far between. But in this moment of despair, a man arose. His name was Elijah. Clad in a rough, weathered garment made of camel's hair, his face wild with uncut hair and a look that burned with the fire of God's righteousness, Elijah appeared as a force of nature in the midst of Israel's spiritual decay. His presence was like a thunderclap in a world that had grown numb to the voice of God. He was not like the other prophets. He was no mere messenger. He was God's bold instrument, chosen to confront the king, the queen, and the entire nation in their idolatry. The reigning monarch of Israel at the time was King Ahab, a man whose heart was as hard as his kingdom was corrupt. Ahab was a puppet of his wicked wife, Queen Jezebel, whose zeal for Baal worship had engulfed the nation. Together, they led the people of Israel astray, bowing before idols, sacrificing to false gods, and turning their backs on the Lord who had brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and into the land of promise. Elijah, undaunted by their power, entered the palace with a message that would shake the very foundations of their kingdom. With eyes that blazed with divine authority, he declared, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." And with those words, the skies above Israel grew still. The heavens, once full of life-giving rain, now closed their doors. The earth grew thirsty and dry. For 3 long years, the land was ravaged by drought. No rain fell from the sky. No dew kissed the earth. The rivers ran dry, the crops withered, and the people cried out in desperation. But Elijah was not among them. He did not cower in fear or retreat from the coming judgment. Instead, he followed the Lord's guidance, retreating to a place of refuge, a brook named Cherith. There, in the solitude of the wilderness, God provided for his servant. Each day, ravens, creatures known for their hunger and selfishness, came to Elijah with bread and meat, bringing the provisions he needed to survive. And by the stream, he drank the cool water that flowed from the earth. Elijah was not forsaken, for the Lord's hand was upon him. Yet, as the drought wore on and the brook began to dry up, God once again called Elijah to act. "Go," the Lord commanded him, "to Zarephath in the region of Sidon. I have commanded a widow there to supply you with food." Elijah set out, traveling to a land that was not his own. When he arrived in Zarephath, he found a widow gathering sticks to prepare her last meal. She was a woman of great poverty, and when Elijah asked her for water, she gave it without hesitation. But when he asked her to bring him a piece of bread, the widow's eyes were filled with sorrow and fear. She confessed that she had only a handful of flour left in a jar and a little oil in a jug, just enough to prepare one last meal for herself and her son before they died. But Elijah, confident in God's provision, spoke words that would change her life forever. "Do not be afraid," he said. Go home and make a small loaf of bread for me first, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. The widow, filled with both doubt and hope, obeyed. She made the bread, and to her astonishment, the jar of flour and the jug of oil did not run dry. Day after day, there was always enough. God had provided, just as he had promised. But the miracles did not stop there. One day, the widow's son fell ill. So ill, in fact, that he stopped breathing. The widow, stricken with grief, cried out to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and bring death to my son?" Elijah, moved with compassion, took the boy in his arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying. He stretched himself out upon the child, crying out to God in desperation, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." And the Lord heard Elijah's cry. The child's breath returned, and he revived. Elijah took the boy and brought him back to his mother, saying, "See, your son is alive." The widow, astonished and filled with gratitude, declared, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Elijah's life, though marked by trials and hardships, was a testimony to the faithfulness of God. In the face of Israel's rebellion, in the midst of a land suffering from drought, Elijah stood as a beacon of God's power, reminding the people that the Lord is a God who provides, who heals, and who answers the cries of his servants. After 3 years of drought and silence, the time had finally come. The heavens had not opened, the rain had not fallen, and Israel remained in the grip of its rebellion. The challenge between the true God of Israel and the false god Baal was about to reach its dramatic climax. Elijah, God's prophet, knew it was time to confront the evil that had consumed the land and prove once and for all who the true God was. God commanded Elijah to go to Ahab, the wicked king who had led Israel astray, and to bring him face to face with the reality of his sin. With unwavering courage, Elijah approached Ahab and declared, "Summon the people of Israel and all the prophets of Baal to Mount Carmel. It is time for a showdown." The air was thick with tension as the people gathered at the foot of Mount Carmel. On one side, 450 prophets of Baal, clothed in their ritual garments, stood with confident smiles, believing their false god would triumph. On the other side, Elijah stood alone, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the mountain, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The challenge he laid before the crowd echoed through the ages. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." A hush fell over the crowd. The people were torn, uncertain, caught between the truth they had once known and the idols they had embraced. But Elijah made his challenge clear, "You call on your gods, and I will call on the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." The prophets of Baal, confident in their false worship, went first. They constructed an altar, laid their sacrifice upon it, and began their wild dance. Their chants rose to the sky, calling upon Baal to send fire from heaven to consume the offering. For hours they danced and shouted, their voices hoarse from crying out. But the heavens remained silent. As midday passed, Elijah watched the prophets of Baal, unmoved by their desperate pleas. With a touch of irony, Elijah taunted them. "Shout louder," he mocked. "Surely Baal is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and needs to be awakened." The prophets of Baal, desperate to prove their power, cried louder. They began to cut themselves with swords and spears, their blood staining the altar as they begged their god to respond. Yet, despite their frantic efforts, no fire came. The altar remained untouched, the sacrifice undisturbed. By the time the sun began to set, Elijah knew it was his turn. He stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with divine authority. He first repaired the broken altar of the Lord, which had been neglected and abandoned in the years of idolatry. With careful hands, he set the stones in place and prepared the sacrifice. Then, to demonstrate the undeniable power of the one true God, Elijah did something extraordinary. He commanded that 4 large jars of water be poured over the altar, drenching the sacrifice, the wood, and the stones until the water ran down and filled the trench he had dug around the altar. This wasn't just any fire. it would have to be a fire from God himself. The people watched in silence, puzzled and unsure. What could Elijah be doing? It was not only a test of divine power, it was a challenge to the very nature of faith. Elijah then stepped back, lifted his eyes toward heaven, and prayed. There was no elaborate chanting, no frantic gestures, just a simple, heartfelt prayer. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And then, as if the heavens could no longer contain the might of God, fire rained down from the sky. It was no ordinary fire, it was divine, a consuming blaze of holy power. The fire burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water in the trench. The entire altar was consumed in an instant, leaving nothing but the charred earth where it had once stood. The crowd stood in stunned silence, their mouths agape in awe. Then, as one, they fell to the ground in worship, crying out in unison, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The truth was undeniable. The God of Israel had shown himself in power and glory, while Baal, the god they had worshipped in vain, was silent. The people, who had wavered between false gods and the true God, now knew with certainty that there was only one God worthy of worship. But Elijah's work was not done. With righteous fury, he turned to the false prophets and commanded that they be seized. There, on that mountaintop, the 450 prophets of Baal were taken and destroyed, their false religion brought to an end in a single stroke. Elijah stood victorious. He had proven, through God's fire, that the Lord was the one true God. And with the people's hearts now turned back to God, the skies, which had been silent for so long, would soon open again. After the breathtaking triumph on Mount Carmel, where God had answered with fire and proved his supremacy, Elijah must have felt invincible. He had confronted the false prophets, demonstrated God's power, and witnessed the hearts of the people turn back to the Lord. But victory does not always erase the deep wounds of the soul. Even the strongest among us can falter in moments of weariness. The very next chapter of Elijah's story is a somber one. Queen Jezebel, seething with rage over the death of her prophets, swore vengeance against the prophet who had humiliated her gods. She sent a message to Elijah, her voice cold and filled with wrath. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Fear seized Elijah's heart. How could he, the prophet who had just stood against 450 false prophets and seen God's power displayed in unimaginable glory, now be so shaken by a woman's wrath? Yet, in that moment of fear, the weight of the past few years, of battle, loneliness, and spiritual exhaustion, crashed down on him. Elijah ran. He fled into the wilderness, his body heavy with exhaustion, his heart burdened with hopelessness. He was a man who had just witnessed the might of God, yet now he felt abandoned. His faith, once so unshakable, seemed to crumble beneath the crushing weight of fear. He felt alone, empty, and useless. At last, after days of fleeing, he collapsed under a broom tree. There, in the wilderness, Elijah prayed a prayer of despair, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." He had fought the battle, won the victory, but now it all felt meaningless. The exhaustion of the journey, both physical and spiritual, had drained him. He could not go on. He had nothing left. But God did not answer Elijah's prayer with judgment or condemnation. Instead, the Lord responded with compassion. An angel appeared to Elijah, not in wrath, but in mercy. The angel gently touched Elijah and said, "Get up and eat." Beside him, there was a cake of bread, baked over hot coals, and a jar of water. Elijah ate, drank, and then fell back to sleep. God did not rebuke him for his fear. God did not scold him for his moment of weakness. Instead, God provided for his physical needs, offering him rest and nourishment. After Elijah slept, the angel came again, saying, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." This time, Elijah ate and drank, and the food strengthened him for a journey that would take him 40 days and nights into the wilderness, to the very mountain of God, Mount Horeb. It was here, on Mount Horeb, that Elijah would find not just physical renewal, but a spiritual awakening. He arrived exhausted, lonely, and desperate, but God was not finished with him yet. Elijah entered a cave, seeking refuge from the weight of his despair. And there, in the stillness of that cave, Elijah encountered God, but not in the ways he had expected. First came a mighty wind. It tore through the mountains, breaking apart rocks as it passed, but God was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, shaking the very ground beneath his feet, but God was not in the earthquake. After that, a fire blazed across the mountain, but again, God was not in the fire. Elijah's heart must have been racing with expectation, but nothing came. No powerful display of God's might, no earth-shattering moment that he had experienced on Mount Carmel. No, God was not in any of these mighty acts. Then, after the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, there came a gentle whisper. In that moment, Elijah knew. God had not abandoned him. God had not left him to face his fears alone. It was in the quiet, in the stillness, in the whisper of his presence, that Elijah experienced the deep, tender voice of God. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God asked, not in anger, but with understanding. Elijah replied, his voice trembling with the weight of his soul, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." But God did not rebuke him. Instead, he gave Elijah new direction, a renewed sense of purpose. "Go back the way you came," God instructed, "and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also, anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel, and anoint Elisha son of Shaphat from Abel-Meholah to succeed you as prophet." God's words were clear. Elijah was not finished. His work was not done. There were still kings to be anointed, still a new prophet to be chosen, and still a plan that God was unfolding. Elijah had felt alone, but God reminded him that he was not finished with him, that there were 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed their knees to Baal, who were still faithful to the Lord. And with that, Elijah was renewed. His strength was restored, his hope revived. He left the cave with a new sense of purpose, knowing that the Lord was still with him, still guiding him, and still working through him. As the years unfolded, Elijah's ministry continued with unwavering faithfulness to God. Yet, there was a weight on his heart, a knowledge that his time on earth was drawing to a close. God had already revealed to him that he would be taken up to heaven in a dramatic and supernatural way, and though his heart was steadfast, there was a quiet urgency to the way he moved. Elijah knew it was time to pass the torch. He had spent years preparing for this moment, but now, with the end of his earthly journey so near, the time had come to focus on the one who would carry his mantle forward. That man was Elisha, the young prophet who had been called by Elijah to follow him, to witness his works, and to learn from him. Elisha had become more than a student. He had become a devoted companion, a faithful servant, and someone with whom Elijah had forged a deep spiritual bond. One day, Elijah and Elisha stood at the edge of the Jordan River. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if the very earth sensed the impending departure of the great prophet. Elijah, with the solemnity of someone who knew the time was short, took off his cloak. He folded it and, with a single motion, struck the waters of the Jordan River. The waters parted. Just as they had done for the Israelites in days long past, the waters of the Jordan split apart, creating a dry path through the riverbed. Elijah and Elisha walked through the river, their footsteps echoing in the quiet. It was a powerful moment, one that reminded both men of God's faithfulness and power throughout history. This was no ordinary journey. It was a journey that marked the final steps of a great prophet, the passing of a divine mantle. As they crossed to the other side, Elijah, knowing that his time had come, turned to Elisha and asked, "What can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha, his heart full of reverence and awe for his master, did not ask for wealth or fame. He asked for something far greater. With the humility of a servant and the boldness of a man called by God, Elisha made his request, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Elijah's eyes met Elisha's, and he responded, "You have asked a difficult thing. Yet, if you see me taken from you, it will be yours. But if you do not, it will not." Elisha, aware of the enormity of the request he had made, did not waver. He knew that Elijah's spirit was a gift from God, a gift that carried the weight of anointing and power. He knew that to inherit a double portion of that spirit would mean a calling far beyond anything he had ever known. And he knew that his journey with Elijah was nearing its end, but that a new journey was about to begin. Together, they continued their journey, no longer as master and servant in the traditional sense, but as two men bound by a shared purpose, walking side by side toward a moment of profound transformation. They were walking toward the end of one chapter, but more importantly, toward the beginning of the next. The journey of Elijah and Elisha was nearing its dramatic, divine conclusion. For all the miracles and wonders that Elijah had witnessed and performed in his lifetime, nothing could prepare him for the moment that awaited him, the moment when heaven itself would claim him. They walked together, side by side, as the quiet, golden light of the day began to settle in around them. The air was thick with the knowledge of something extraordinary that was about to take place. Then, as if the earth itself could sense the great transition about to unfold, a powerful force from the heavens broke through the stillness, a mighty whirlwind, like a rushing storm, appearing out of nowhere. The wind howled around them, and Elisha looked up in awe. In the midst of the whirlwind, something even more awe-inspiring descended from the heavens. It was a chariot of fire, drawn by horses of fire, a sight beyond words, a blaze of glory and power. The chariot's flames seemed to burn with the very essence of heaven, and the horses, wild with heavenly strength, galloped through the air, their fiery manes shining like the sun. And there, in the midst of the whirlwind and fire, Elijah, the great prophet of Israel, was lifted up, his body caught by the divine force, rising higher and higher, until he was no longer visible. It was not a death, but a glorious ascent, a journey to the throne of God itself. The wind roared, the flames danced in the sky, and Elijah was gone, swept into the heavens by the very chariot of fire that had come to take him. Elisha stood, rooted to the spot, his heart torn between grief and awe. He cried out, his voice full of anguish and reverence, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." It was a cry of loss, but also of recognition. Recognition that Elijah was not just his mentor, but the very protector and spiritual strength of Israel. The chariots of fire were not just a heavenly spectacle. They symbolized the divine strength that had carried Israel through all of its trials. And then, as quickly as it had come, the chariot of fire was gone. The whirlwind quieted, and the sky closed. Elijah was no more. His body, his presence, his ministry, all were now in the realm of the divine, beyond the reach of men. But the story did not end there. In the silence that followed, Elisha was left standing alone, his heart heavy with the loss of his master, yet filled with a fierce resolve. The mantle of Elijah, the very cloak that had marked him as a prophet of God, lay on the ground where Elijah had stood moments before. With trembling hands but a steady heart, Elisha picked up the mantle, the symbol of his mentor's prophetic power. He stood for a moment, holding it tightly, feeling the weight of the responsibility now resting upon him. Then, with boldness, he walked to the edge of the Jordan River, the same river that Elijah had parted before. He stood there for a moment, staring at the water, knowing that the time had come for him to step into his new role. With a single motion, Elisha took the mantle and struck the waters of the Jordan, just as Elijah had done before him. And again, as if the river itself recognized the passing of power, the waters parted, creating a dry path through the riverbed. Elisha crossed over, the mantle of Elijah now upon him, his heart filled with the spirit of his master, the spirit of prophecy. The mantle had passed from Elijah to Elisha, and with it, the power of God was now on Elisha. He was no longer just a servant, no longer just a disciple. He was the prophet of Israel, carrying the weight of Elijah's legacy, the anointing of the God of Israel, and the calling that would define the rest of his life. Elijah's departure from the earth in the chariot of fire was not the end of his story. Though his body was taken up to heaven, his name, his very essence, remained etched in the annals of history as a symbol of unwavering faith, bold courage, and divine power. His legacy was one of unflinching devotion to God, even in the face of opposition, and his actions would echo through the ages. In his lifetime, Elijah had confronted kings and queens, defied false prophets, and called down fire from heaven to prove the supremacy of the one true God. His voice had resounded in a nation fallen into darkness, calling the people of Israel to repentance. He had stood alone against the tide of idolatry, unwavering in his mission to uphold God's truth. His moments of fear and despair, his flight into the wilderness and his encounter with God on Mount Horeb, served as powerful reminders of the strength that comes from trusting in God, even when one feels alone. Elijah's story was one of faith tested and proven in the crucible of trial, a testament to the power of a man wholly devoted to God. Though Elijah was taken up in a whirlwind and did not experience death in the way others had, his journey was not over. His legacy endured and transcended time, for God had chosen a unique way for Elijah to return. Many centuries later, during the transfiguration of Jesus, Elijah appeared once again, not as a specter or a memory, but in person. There, on the mountaintop, Elijah stood beside Moses, the great lawgiver, conversing with Jesus. It was a moment of divine revelation, a symbolic meeting of the Old Covenant and the New, with Elijah representing the prophets of old, the voice of God calling the people to righteousness, and Moses representing the law that guided them. This miraculous appearance of Elijah was not just a demonstration of his enduring presence in the heavenly realm, but a testimony to the unbroken nature of God's plan throughout history. It was a reminder that Elijah, though he had walked the earth long ago, was still part of the eternal story of God's redemptive work. Elijah's life was not merely a collection of miraculous events, nor was it defined solely by his fiery judgments and his dramatic confrontation with the forces of evil. It was a life lived in utter devotion to the will of God. Elijah was not perfect. He experienced doubt, fear, and moments of despair, but his commitment to God remained steadfast. His story is a beacon to all who face adversity, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, God provides, God leads, and God remains faithful. The legacy of Elijah, the prophet of fire, burned brighter than ever. His story is a living testament to the power of a single man, utterly devoted to God, to change the course of history. And for those who hear his story today, the call remains. Stand firm in your faith, trust in God's provision, and know that his power is greater than any force that may stand in your way. Elijah's spirit, his unwavering courage, and his unshakable trust in God continue to inspire and challenge us to live lives that reflect the same devotion and boldness in the face of the world's darkness. Elijah's life was a remarkable testament to the unwavering strength that comes from trusting in God, a journey marked by miracles, struggles, and divine purpose. His prophetic voice shattered the darkness of his time, and his fearless stand against the forces of evil left an indelible mark on Israel's history. Yet, his story did not end with his ascent into the heavens. Elijah's legacy, his courage, his devotion, and his unshakable faith, continues to inspire believers today. As a symbol of God's power to work through those who trust in him, Elijah calls us to live boldly in faith, stand firm against the trials we face, and embrace the divine purpose that God has set before us. His flame burns on, lighting the way for all who seek to follow in his footsteps. What do you think about this Bible's stories? Or, do you have any insights or perspectives to add? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your advice and opinions. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more biblical stories just like this. May God bless you with wisdom, strength, and peace.